Welcome to this episode of the RavenCast for February 17th, 2017. Is the truth still out there? A live conversation with theologian Grant Kaplan. I'm Suzanne Ross, and the RavenCast is part of the Raven Review, an online magazine where we write and talk about mimetic theory and the rivalry, violence, and scapegoating that divide our communities and our world. Our motto at the Raven Review is, change your view, change the world. So if you like to hear new perspectives on religion, politics, pop culture, and current events, perspectives that bridge divides and bring people together, then please subscribe to the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. It's a real pleasure today to welcome our friend and fellow mimetic theory junkie, Professor Grant Kaplan, to today's RavenCast. Hi, Grant.
Hi, Suzanne.
Thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure and an honor. So good to be part of what you're doing here.
Oh, well, you're part of our inspiration, I'll tell you that. Just a quick introduction, Grant. For you, Grant Kaplan is Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at St. Louis University in St. Louis, and you received your PhD from Boston College. And today, Grant, we're going to be talking about your most recent book, Rene Girard, Unlikely Apologist, which focuses on mimetic theory and bringing mimetic theory into conversation with fundamental theology. And when I saw that title of your book, I talked to Adam Erickson, our resident theologian. I said, Adam, what's fundamental theology? And he's like, I don't know. And we were like, I don't know. But reading your book, I realized that mimetic theory is just actually engaged with all of the things that fundamental theology engages with. And we'll be talking about that as our conversation goes on. But our topic for today is the search for truth. And we were hoping that people would recognize that as a reference to the X-Files, the hit TV series where the motto was, the truth is out there. And right now, in our context, it seems a bit naive to think that there is truth to be found, or even that there's such a thing as truth. The characters Mulder and Scully, remember those guys? They never lost their faith in the truth, but we've begun to doubt it, whether it exists at all. So what I'd like us to start with, Grant, is to ask you a question for you to answer as a theologian. When you hear that term post-truth, what does it bring up for you?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is just that it's nonsense. It's nonsense in the truest sense of what nonsense is, namely that, are we in a post-truth world? Well, that statement has to be true or false, but there's no way you kind of can get into that question. And so it's like saying to someone, I'm lying to you. Well, it doesn't make any sense. You're lying, in which case you're telling the truth. And if you're not lying, you're telling the truth too. So there's a way in which I would say that lying and dishonesty are derivative of truth. It's only because you believe in truth fundamentally or primarily that you can then talk about being dishonest or post-truth or post-fact. And so what we have, I think, is not a crisis of truth, but a crisis of interpretation. And so the society may not necessarily have been concerned with theories of interpretation for a long time, but Christianity certainly has, because one of the main questions that Christianity has had is, how do you interpret the Bible?
Right.
And so Christians and Christian theologians have been trying to work out theories of interpretation. And so I hope that Christianity and theology have resources for the culture about how to kind of navigate these terms, post-truth, post-fact, for people who are sort of hearing them for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, we don't normally think of turning to theology for, a way to navigate some of these issues. But as you say, theology has been dealing with not just issues of interpretation, but issues of truth as well, of what does it mean to make a truth claim about something, which is, of course, at the heart of Christianity. But let's talk a little bit about, if you can explain to us about what fundamental theology deals with, and in particular, the questions of whether human beings can access the truth, and how would we, how do we encounter the truth, or how do we, acquire knowledge of the truth?
So fundamental theology it's more of a Catholic thing than a Protestant thing. And so fundamental theology is, in a way, a kind of theological version of apologetics. And so a lot of times what people do in apologetics is they'll say, well, I want you to believe what I believe, but I'll bracket out all of the things that I believe on faith, that I believe through scripture, through what my church teaches, or anything like this. And I'll just give you a purely scientific or a philosophical explanation and for the existence of God, or whatever it happens to be. And what fundamental theology does is it sort of gets at the border of theology. It wants to talk to people who are both believers and non-believers, but it wants to do it in such a way that it does not bracket out the theological and pretend that it didn't exist. So it works from, I guess, within a faith perspective to talk to people outside of a faith perspective.
Okay, so if it's not bracketing out those things that we normally say have to do with faith, well, what do you do with those from a fundamental theology perspective?
Well, so a lot of it is just sort of understanding the relationship between different things, like I do in the Bible, for instance, faith and reason, or what I do in the book about faith and reason, or religion and science, or secularity and religious tradition or religious community, or belief in God and atheism. And so it's trying to sort of understand the basis on which the terms operate. And sometimes if people just don't understand the presumptions of their own discipline, then they don't understand how it relates to other disciplines. So part of it is bringing like theology and philosophy in a better conversation.
Well, let's look at that faith reason conversation, because a lot of times we see these in opposition to each other. And, even in the X-Files thing, they had the two characters, Mulder had this belief in aliens. And so he saw evidence of aliens everywhere he looked. And Scully was the scientist, and she was very skeptical and always looking for the evidence. Well, show me the evidence, right? So we often think that they can't coexist, that faith and reason don't coexist. But certainly Girard didn't think that, as he was a very Catholic thinker in that regard, right? So can you explain to us how Catholic theology looks at this connection between faith and reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be in a lot of ways very similar to Protestantism in that, Anselm had a famous formula for theology. Faith-seeking understanding was his definition of it. And so the idea is that faith is prior, and then the point is to give, or the point of theology is to give as much intelligibility or to understanding to faith as possible, and that this actually does help. It advances one's faith in a way if one understands it better. And so I think there's a kind of, if you just look at the history of Christianity, you see things like founding universities, which are betting really that if faith concerns are brought together with intellectual pursuit, quest for truth, that both sides will flourish, as it were. And so there's a sort of hope in it. And I think Girard had that hope. I think he didn't always express it very clearly, but he thought that being a Christian gave him insight into all kinds of things that he wouldn't have had if he weren't. But that at the same time, he thought his own theory stood on its own 2 feet as a scientific theory.
Right, and that has caused in the mimetic theory world a little bit of confusion about what do we say mimetic theory is. Is it a scientific theory, or is it for Christians only? Is it just Christian apologetic, as you argue in your book? That's not what he was trying to do. But I think that you're saying that faith comes first sounds a little suspect to people who are coming from a purely secular background. So how, if fundamental theology is trying to talk to people who are not believers, what do you say to them in that regard, that faith comes first and then you seek to understand your faith? Can you come to faith the other way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are searching for truth without faith, and they find arguments in Christianity that are compelling. In terms of the formula itself and the priority of faith, that was just a sort of rule for a theologian, or rules for theologians. But I'll introduce an idea that it kind of gets at your question, but it won't seem like it at first. And the idea is, it gets back to this problem of interpretations. And so you take these tapes of the police shooting unarmed black men. And this gets to the whole sort of post-truth, post-fact stuff. And most people watch these tapes and they see something like just what happened. But inevitably, there are people who watch the tapes, and somehow they seem to end up on the juries, but they watch the tapes and they see that the officer was not culpable at all. And what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that everyone comes to whatever they're looking at from a certain perspective, with certain biases, with a kind of history of expecting certain things. So people in certain kinds of communities, for instance, African-American communities, they see these incidents, or they just simply hear about them, like the Michael Brown, where we don't have videotape. They simply hear about them, and it just confirms the same thing that happens all the time happened yet again. And for other groups and other communities, they see it as instead something that that never happens, so they almost have to constrain themselves to see it happening. And so in this sense, I would say that everyone's right to question theologians who have faith as a sort of priority, but the matter is whether or not other disciplines or non-Christians are also doing the same kind of thing, and whether or not they're aware of it. So bringing certain biases, interpretations, perspectives into how they look at, quote unquote, the facts or the reality out there.
Right. So if we're on a search for truth, then I hear you saying that it begins with maybe becoming aware of your own biases, the things that you're sort of, conditioned to see without even maybe being aware that you've been conditioned to see them.
Yes, that's certainly a big thing, and a big part for Girard was conversion. That the conversion experience is one in which you have a kind of unveiling, and you see, these are all the things that I couldn't see before because, in a way, I was blind. And so that's a kind of helpful. For Girard, conversion's so important.
Yeah.
And it's precisely this kind of turning around, seeing things from a different perspective, from the perspective of the victim versus the oppressor.
But are some perspectives or inclinations to see things a certain way more true than others?
Certainly. No, absolutely. And this is a big problem, that we have all kinds of default assumptions that the way we view things is not only the way things are, but the right way to look at it.
Right.
And sometimes it takes a lot of unwinding for people to look at it another way. And it's very difficult for this kind of thing to happen. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why Girard went so often to this interpersonal language, all the way back to Deceit, Desire, in the novelist's first book, this interpersonal language about conversion, this sort of thing.
Yeah, because he says even that first book, which was not explicitly Christian, really, he said, all of my books have been written from a Christian perspective. And he included his book about novels and novelists. So is it, let's just dig out that a little more. What was it about looking at things from a Christian perspective that he found gave him access to things he wouldn't have gotten to otherwise?
Yeah, I think it's in that the French title that's not quite translated in Deceit, Desire, in the novel. It's that romantic deceit and novelistic truth.
Yes. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So the romantic deceit is in a way, a sort of default perspective that he saw in these romantic novelists, in which the hero isn't affected by everyone else. The hero's kind of above it. The hero's desires are pure. Everyone else's desires are corrupted. A classic example is someone like Henry David Thoreau, that one line that everyone knows. I went to the woods because I wanted to live deliberately, to be authentic, to be truthful.
Yes.
And it's that individualistic notion that society corrupts, and I'm going to be on the side of the truth tellers over here by going off into the woods. And that's so deeply ingrained within us. And Girard saw in the different novelists this, what he calls a novelistic conversion, in which they see, no, it's not the other where all of the sin and all of the problems and everything else are. It's on me too. I'm part of the problem. And so he actually, he compares Proust to a monk, and he says Proust seems like a Christian in a way, even though Proust never talks specifically about a religious conversion. But yeah, Girard saw what Proust underwent as like a religious conversion.
Yeah, because I think he was very keen on talking about the novelist, and not just their novels, but that somehow through writing about the human condition and them feeling above it all, that the novelist, the writer, became aware that they were as guilty of all these silly behaviors they were critiquing as the characters they were writing about. And there's that ethic of complicity, if you will, that really, when you study mimetic theory, it's so funny because you go through this at least I did, and I know a lot of people do. You go through it and you understand it intellectually, and you go, "Oh yeah, all those people are like that." And then as you study it more and more, you begin to feel yourself indicted by it. You're like, "Oh my God, wait a minute," and that's when you really get it, right? That's
Yes.
when you get it. So, and I think that's why you well document and talk about this in the book, that you can completely understand mimetic theory from just an intellectual perspective and never get to that sort of conversion point, which is why it's just a scientific theory if you want to just leave it there.
Yeah.
But it has that, I think, that element of awakening, of self-awareness, that is why people are such strong adherents to it. I think the real fans of mimetic theory are ones that have been transformed in that way by it.
Yes. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Mimetic theory has also come under criticism as being, explicitly Christian and a little too triumphal about proclaiming Christianity as the only way to access the truth about the human condition, let alone about God, but especially about the human condition. And so do you think that there's room for other faiths to access the same sort of awareness of the novelistic truth, or experience that kind of conversion?
I mean, I think there definitely is, and the most obvious religion, I think, would be Buddhism, because it's such a strong emphasis on desire, controlling desires, seeing desires as a kind of engine of everything. And when Girard wrote a lot of those things, he had in mind, the French Parisian intellectual world in which everybody who wasn't Christian was secular, and that was the overwhelming majority of people. And so I think he wanted to give Christianity the strongest possible defense. And then when people asked him about this other stuff, Hinduism, Buddhism, it was always, there's tremendous insight there. And he does some nice readings of the Hindu texts. Now, he doesn't think that they necessarily have the full understanding of the scapegoat mechanism, but in terms of understanding desire and this kind of thing, he sees it operative in other places.
For sure. Well, and I've always thought all these different religions are here for different reasons, revealing different truths to us. I mean, if Christianity's got the scapegoat mechanism knocked, okay, good. And then we can turn to the other faiths for other, insights about other things. I don't think it makes them less true. I think a lot of times mimetic theory people go to other religions looking for the same thing that they're finding in the Christian revelation, and that's a misguided way to approach certainly respectful dialogue with other religions, to be sure.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, it would be an irony for an exponent of mimetic theory to then find oneself in total rivalry with another religious tradition, which results in an escalation in violence and all these kind of things.
Yeah, just because we are experts in it doesn't mean we don't do it.
Yes, exactly.
Unfortunately, the case. I want to move a little deeper into mimetic theory, and especially to talk about Rene's insights about grace and how essential grace is to understanding the truth about ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about, without, giving a whole discourse on it, about what Rene discovered about human origins and the scapegoat mechanism, and why it takes grace to free us from it.
Yeah, what he saw across all cultures was religion based around victim, based around sacrifice, based around scapegoating, and that what he saw in the Judeo-Christian was something so different, a kind of total reversal, a deconstruction of all of that religious energy going a certain way, and so the question is whether one could discover this through sort of like romantic genius and then find oneself completely free of it, or whether it is the discovery is comes to us as a gift, as a truth that we're allowed to settle into, that we can slowly come to recognize. And I think, one of the reasons it's not just a teaching in Christianity, it's not just a parable or a fable. There was this guy named Jesus who, these things happen. And it's sort of Aesop's fable that would give you the knowledge of the scapegoat mechanism, is that almost once it becomes a story that we can intellectualize, then we're never going to let it sink all the way down. And so only when it becomes an event, a real historical thing, yes, this person named Jesus did live amongst these people. These things did happen. And then the community of disciples encountered the risen Jesus as forgiving victim. And then they went on to transform the world through this knowledge and experience. I think that... so it has to be something that we undergo, and it comes from what our good friend James Allison calls the other. So not the social other that gives us all these desires, but another other that in whom we're with no rivalry. And so I think the way that knowledge comes to us, the shape of that knowledge or insight is the shape is graced. It's a graced shape, and that when we experience grace, we experience something that we couldn't achieve on our own, and it feels different from figuring out something on your own. It just feels different the way the truth comes to us, and that for Girard, because of that anthropological reality, then we needed to find a language of grace and use a language of grace to talk about it, and that's where I think he found Christianity indispensable.
To be very helpful, yeah, because the way he describes the scapegoat mechanism and scapegoating in general is that the participants in it don't know that they're participating in a scapegoating event. It has its own logic, its own self-fulfilling logic that doesn't seem flawed at all from the inside. And that's sort of where this, that how do you get out of that when it doesn't look like it needs to be gotten out of?
Yes, it looks like something that's totally true and justifiable.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then you're back in this problem of the perspective and being convinced that your perspective's the right one, and that, of course, it's these people that are the problem, or of course this thing is the only way to do it. And so it's something needs to come along so radical to sort of shake us out of this.
Well, and that's, the cover that you chose for the book is the conversion of Saul, who was going about his business thinking perfectly justified, and suddenly he gets knocked to the ground with this revelation that comes from somewhere else, right? Some
Yeah.
knowledge. And it's funny because when I was thinking about this in context of the X-Files, I was thinking, sometimes the grace can feel like a little bit of like, you're being knocked down, like it doesn't feel pleasant maybe at first. And I think a lot of us may have the experience of sort of resisting these kinds of insights, because it does upend the way you've ordered your life and interpreted the world and figured things out. It's very it's like a little bit of an alien invasion.
Yeah. No, my favorite character in Flannery O'Connor is Mary Grace, not a very subtle name.
No.
who throws the shoe in that waiting room at the old lady and, calls her a pig or something like this. And that was for Flannery O'Connor, like this experience of grace. It's like someone throwing a book at your head or something like this. But the Paul conversion thing, it's powerful because the words are, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And what Saul does not say back is, oh God, I'm not persecuting you. I'm persecuting all these bad people over here. That's what he doesn't say. And that's what we always say. We're not persecuting Jesus. We're not persecuting the innocent victim. We're persecuting someone who deserves it. And the persecution goes exactly hand in hand with the sense that they deserve it.
Absolutely. Yeah. You quote this wonderful saying of Girard's that we're quite proficient in discovering other people's scapegoats, but we only have legitimate enmities.
That was a great line.
It's awesome.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the favorite sentences I've read by Girard, and that's the mystery. I mean, it doesn't matter how long one's studied mimetic theory or been a Christian or anything like this. It's that the pull towards scapegoating is so strong, and we find ourselves wrapped up in it continuously, and that's why. I mean, the Christianity has this long tradition of liturgy and practices and prayers and asceticism that are all supposed to kind of help us deal with understanding what's going on up here, so that it doesn't take us, 5 years or 3 weeks or 3 days before we realize we're scapegoating.
Yeah. Well, you make me think about the contemporary sort of news cycle and the way everything is going at such a fast pace. We don't have time to reflect on our immediate reaction before there's another thing that's requiring our immediate reaction. And I know I myself, I just have a hard time not thinking, I know who the bad guy is here. I know, and I know it's not me, and so almost the way our culture has speeded things up, it doesn't even leave room for the possibility of saying, interestingly, Saul was on a nice long walk when this happened. I mean, he was in, there was some sort of space in between. I hadn't really thought about it that way before, but we don't have any space anymore.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And it means that there is increased capacity for obviously escalation to take place, and high, if someone's writing you a nasty letter and it takes, okay, let's say it's London in the 19th century. I mean, the mail got delivered twice a day. Even then, you have a few hours to stew on it. But if it's Twitter, now the thing that scares me most is everyone I know who has an Apple phone looks at it every time there's a message. So you don't even have the time to pull your phone out of your pocket. You're just going like this. Here, I got my arm here. And that to me, it's almost like the lag of 5 seconds to see what someone said was too much. And so this kind of feverish thing. And what we see is that usually the best and most thoughtful things aren't the most immediate things that come out of us. But the most powerful thing that we have inside of us is the immediate reaction. You think about all those strong emotions, and they're the initial ones, anger, rage, love, whatever it is. It comes so strong at the outset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We should all go on retreat. It would be good.
Retreats are good, to taking a space, just inhaling slowly and exhaling.
Yeah, before you tweet and retweet again. Girard has this interesting sort of definition of Christianity, of Christian conversion. He says to become Christian is fundamentally to perceive that it isn't just others who have scapegoats. And I think, if you ask people about Christian conversion, that probably isn't the first explanation they come up with it. But for Girard, it was the most important thing. That was the key. Can you just reflect on that as a way of thinking about Christian conversion?
Yeah. For Girard, Christianity is very interpersonal. And he saw, the nice thing about mimetic theory is that it's a social theory, but then it's also an individual theory. It's sort of like sociology and psychology have one kind of unified theory in mimetic theory. And the biggest problem people would have with that definition of Girard is that it doesn't get you out in the world doing all those works of justice, building the soup kitchens and the clean drinking water and the schools and everything like that. It's a little bit, it wants people to be a little bit more reflective, maybe a little bit more introverted. And so I think if you compare it to something like liberation theology, well, in liberation theology, or at least a certain kind of caricature of it, it's all about this sort of sinful social and economic structures, and that we should all be working to undo those sinful structures. So the interpersonal kind of doesn't matter as much. I mean, it may matter individually to those people, but they're saying this is what Christianity is fundamentally about. And I think we do have a fair amount of data on how that's working. And it's just the case that the interpersonal element, personal relationship with God, is it's essential for keeping going. And if one is constantly caught up in escalation and rivalry and these kinds of things, you're probably not going to be that good at getting clean drinking water and all those other things. And so, I think the way most Christians understand Christianity and its kind of mission in the world today, right now, I think overall a good dose of mimetic theory could help. And I think ideally, we have this model in the Bible of Martha and Mary, and we could all probably do a lot better at being both Martha and Mary. So most of us really aren't that good at being Mary, even if we're not Martha, not sitting at Jesus's feet. And so, if the story went on, I bet you the next night, Martha would let Mary sit at Jesus's feet and she go serve the people. Maybe she wouldn't complain about it. But so I think, those are just some thoughts about, how people might react to mimetic theory as kind of fundamental way to understand what Christianity is supposed to be.
Right. It is interesting that you brought it up in terms of the social justice thing, because when I talk with my people at my church, about, the current political climate and our, cultures, the way we're resisting and we're outraged and we're just all, and I talk about, just be careful, you might be scapegoating and you might, be missing something about yourself in all of this and whatever. And right away, the immediate reaction is, but don't we have to do something? And what about the victims? Who's going to protect the victims? What should I respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's imperative to protect victims and be a voice for the victims. The problem is that we have conflicting groups claiming victimhood, So Black Lives Matter is don't forget about us, and Blue Lives Matter is don't forget about us. And so it becomes very difficult to just find a way out of that kind of mess. And yeah, I mean, I think sometimes Girard, his thought probably could have stood to be a little bit more politically engaged. But I think over the long haul, there is a kind of wisdom in just again, sort of understanding what's happening inside oneself in order to be the kind of person who, represents what Christianity is supposed to represent.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when you talk about the identity groups, groups that are seeing themselves as being victimized or at least being overlooked. They do then tend to be in rivalry. It's like, well, if you're paying attention to Black Lives Matter, you must not be paying attention to the Blue Lives. And for some reason, we see like that they're in competition or something. And I know I've seen this sort of critique of identity politics in that way, that it starts out as a good thing. You're trying to give voice to a victim group, but somehow it just sort of deteriorates into a competitive field of different victims trying to vie for attention. I mean, do you have any advice on how you advocate for victims without getting caught up in that rivalrous environment?
I mean, I think, there's a basic Christian imperative, do good and avoid evil, sort of bedrock of our ethical behavior. And I think trying to do good while avoiding evil is a good way to navigate a lot of tricky situations that we come up against. And so, but what you point to is a sort of intractable position, when you have two victim groups in rivalry with one another.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the Black Lives Matter people got a lot of flack for not saying something more about the cop who was shot. And then he sort of gave this defense that a lot of people posted. And yeah, I mean, I think, of course, we're just barely learning how to be human. We're barely learning how to accept everyone else as human, and we have a long ways to go. We make some progress, but we have so far to go. And yeah, and I think we know that when we do have a sort of unfiltered message of love, that people do respond to it very positively. So, yeah, one of the things about victims is that the nature of being a victim is that you are, in a sense, voiceless. You don't, you can't speak, And
Yeah.
so I am a little bit concerned with the kind of megaphone that some people bring to proclaim their victim status as a kind of political strategy. And that that to me is very troubling. It was troubling to Girard too. He
Yeah.
talked about kind of ultra Christianity, a sort of perversion in which everyone is trying to out victim the other one.
Right. I think that's one of the things Girard pointed to is that really helped me think about that is that, he talked about taking on a victim identity. But he he pointed out that the scapegoating mechanism doesn't care who the scapegoat is. It's a random thing. It's not like, it's a key part like Grant. Part of your identity is that you're a scapegoat. It's just that you happen to walk into a situation in which you're functioning as the scapegoat, but it's not who you are.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think part of these victim groups get confused that just because you're Black or just because you're a cop or just because you're whatever, out of work, manufacturer or something, it's not that that's some essential thing about yourself. And that's what these victim groups seem to overlook. And I think it's a particular risk nowadays of being a victim, because no one's counseling victims that about this risk of taking on a victim identity.
Yeah, no, it does become a problem. And then if you see yourself just as a victim, then you're out looking for someone to victimize you in a way. And I don't mean to kind of trivialize like the horrible patterns of abuse and these things that people are in, but you take something like the Duke Lacrosse case. Here was this woman who claimed that she was raped by the Duke Lacrosse team, and that everyone who believes and talks about white privilege, it's like, what represents white privilege more than the Duke Lacrosse team? And so, of course they're guilty. Of course they did it. And so there's the rush to judgment and the impulsive and all that stuff. It's all just a mob. And then, well, it turns out that they weren't guilty, and the woman made it all up. And what happens is that everyone's going back to being just as prejudiced as they were before, if not more prejudiced. And the whole thing that we're supposed to be learning, if white privilege is supposed to teach us anything, is that it is a privilege, and that many people are privileged and they have advantages they don't that they take for granted and they don't recognize, and that people aren't starting from a level playing field. And this the desire to scapegoat a group of people to prove this, that they, whatever, just ends up kind of creating or putting up the blinders even thicker for a group of people who don't believe in white privilege.
Right. Well, and that you're right. I mean, having privilege and having sort of more advantages than others really has nothing to do with you either, any more than becoming a victim has to do with who you are. So yeah, it's tricky stuff. It's tricky stuff because we get that's where the interpersonal, interdividual aspect of mimetic theory comes into play, because we're all always just reacting and interrelating with one another. And these positions, well, as any, as Michael Flynn can tell you, you can go from the center of power back down in a heartbeat, and you could go right back up in a heartbeat too. It's really, but you're still you, it's just an odd way. It's not our normal way of thinking about ourselves, because, coming back to what you said earlier about Walden and the romantic lie, we have this feeling of authenticity and autonomy and identity that's fixed. And that's to our disadvantage to think about ourselves that way, I think.
Yes, we're more tied into other people, locked into the other than we like to believe. And that you're closer to the truth if you kind of realize you're locked into these patterns than pretending that you aren't at all. That'll be one way to say it.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's one of the things we've been, working at Raven is trying to, it's very hard to talk about this kind of victim patterns without coming across as if you're trivializing the harm that actually comes to victims. And that's, if anything, mimetic theory is really focused on becoming more and more conscious of the ways in which you are participating in harm without knowing that you're doing it.
Yes. And one of the things with, we also have a 2,000-year record of preaching Christianity, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, and sometimes it sunk in and sometimes it really did not. But I mean, one of the keys seems to be when we talk about the gift of faith is that it's a gift, and we get a sense of being generously welcomed into a space of forgiveness and reconciliation, and also a space of realizing we are loved. And the emotional disposition that follows this, again, according to our friend James Allison, is relaxation. So we feel kind of relaxed into things. And one thing that we just know does not work is for a certain part of the culture, the part that I'm in, the academy, to tell a group of people, whatever, uneducated white voters or, white Republicans, to tell them, well, you're all a bunch of racists and bigots and you make the whole society bad and everything else. It's not working. Or you're ignorant, we're enlightened. That doesn't work either.
Right.
And so there's that sense of just people feel like you actually don't care about me. You despise me. And the only sense in which you care about me is if it's like I'm a person in poverty and you can, lift me out of poverty, like to make yourself feel like a better person. But that's not love or anything. That's not care. That's not solidarity. And so I think, Greg Boyle is the guy who does all that work with gangs, Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, and marvelous work. And what he talks about is, moving into a space of kinship. In other words, understanding that we all belong to one another, and that, words like service and volunteering, they miss that point because there's still a distance between you and the other person. So that sense of we belong together, we're all in this together. We haven't had it in the U.S. for a while. I mean, the only instances really were going back Second World War, we're all in this together. Everyone's rationing their butter. And then the Cold War, we're all in this together. Got to put a man on the moon. We got to collaborate. We got to agree. And then 9/11, and that what we've seen is that the energy, the collectivity from that didn't last very long. It lasted maybe 3 years, 4 years. And then it was, okay, we're back to just at each other's throats. And that's how we've been. And so the only ways in which we as a nation have even got to collectivity is because there's another out there that's bad. That's not ideal, but now we're even far from that not ideal form of group collectivity.
Well, you're right, because the enemy's now within. The enemy is inside us now. And, mimetic theory doesn't advocate scapegoating solutions. It just simply helps us identify them. But it does also identify the mimetic crisis that precedes a scapegoating solution. Do you see the U.S. right now in a kind of mimetic crisis?
Obviously, yes. To kind of identify what we're in right now is uniquely mimetic crisis. I mean, it just, yeah, what we're going through in so many ways, I think, is unprecedented. And I think the sort of tribal understanding that people have politically, where really we're tribes,
Yeah.
it's not helping people see across the line.
Right. And it's not helping us, to get back to our topic here, it's not helping us stay in touch with reality and what is truly going on. If we're constantly just blaming one another, we actually are losing contact with what is true about our mutualness, our mutual complicity in a situation.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's a sense in which we all belong together.
yeah,
We all belong together. There's one big human family, and that obviously there are forces dividing us from each other that are more powerful than that feeling of belonging. And I
yeah.
think Girard understood that.
Right. So if we were going to give someone a takeaway here from this to say, to our conversation, say, how would I recognize if I'm getting close to being in contact with the truth, or how would I recognize that I've lost I've lost my way in finding the truth? Well, how would you give some words of wisdom on that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that Jesus says in the gospel is the truth will set you free.
Hmm.
And so I think a sense of less being at stake in a lot of the micro battles. Who's winning the news cycle this week? These kind of things were just so like this, sort of
Mm-hmm.
holding on to these small little victories. And in a way, we can be vigilant, but also just let go of some of that sense and kind of let ourselves be opened into a different, freer, more relaxed space of, of discipleship, I guess.
Yeah. Because, yeah, you're right. Because that sort of combativeness, we're not free because we're tied in with what, with this rivalry with the other, that we either have to beat them or, prove them wrong or something. So it's very reactive rather than,
Yes.
we don't see that sort of being bound to another in a way that's not healthy for your own sense of freedom, of being free. Yeah. Excellent. Good words of advice,
Thank
Grant.
you very much. I agree. I learned a lot by listening to you, and this was fun.
Well, that's very sweet of you to say. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who joined us live for this conversation. I just want to say again, Grant's book is called Rene Girard, Unlikely Apologist. It was published by Notre Dame Press. Am I right, Grant? So you can find it there, or I'm sure it's on Amazon and wherever great theological books are to be found, I'm sure. So please join us for the RavenCast next Thursday at 12 o'clock. It's 12 o'clock Central, I think, as my colleague Adam Erickson talks with Matthew DiStefano about his latest book, From the Blood of Abel, which is another fascinating book of theology. And as always, you can keep up with our interviews on the RavenCast Facebook page and on the Raven Foundation Facebook page. And if you listen to iTunes or Stitcher, please leave us a 5-star rating and a comment. You can also keep up with our articles and interviews about mimetic theory, politics, pop culture, and current events by subscribing to the Raven Review at ravenfoundation.org. Hope to see you all next Thursday for our talk with Matt DiStefano. Until then, many thanks to Grant Kaplan, and grace and peace be with you.
To you too, Suzanne. Thank you to you and Adam. Great to see you.
Thanks, Grant.